so many people without the effort of the travel. Of course, we will still want to meet, but this kind of things, I hope they will go on.
Sure.
Why not?
Yes, why not? If we have enough topics to discuss.
Yes.
Hi.
Yes.
Ciao, Memo.
So,
Hi.
Hey.
yeah, I agree that it will continue in
Yeah.
spite of the fact that we'll be meeting in present. Yes.
Yes. Have you seen the new format of the GLOW conference?
No?
They decided to have either 3-minute talks or 1-hour talks, but you have to find a contestant. So it's like half an hour each. I'm not sure I like it. 3-minute talk is pretty.
And you have to pay.
Oh, really? I didn't notice that. I
No,
wouldn't
no,
have
no,
said
I
it.
don't-
Dove do I start? Cioè.
I think we should start right now, at least with the announcement. Dear colleagues and friends, I think that most of you are already familiar with the format of our linguistic contest organized by the Linguistic Aperitif Group. Tonight, we discuss a harder topic of syntactic theory that has been a long-standing issue for the last approximately 40 years at least, namely binding. As usual, we have invited two prominent researchers on this problem, Eric Reuland from Utrecht University and Sandhya Sundaresan from the University of Göttingen. Tonight's moderator is Alessandra Giorgi from Ca' Foscari University of Venice. As usual, the two opponents will exchange ideas and give us their view by answering 3 questions offered by the moderator and have 5 minutes each to give us their answers to each question. At the end, the moderator will summarize and comment the results, and then we open the discussion, which will include questions from Zoom and YouTube. For security reasons, the chat microphone and screen sharing functions have been disabled during the debate, but the chat will be active at the end for you to write if you intend to ask a question, and we will enable your microphone. Those of you who won't be able to ask their questions can send it to me via email to the following address, ceciliapoletto@gmail.com. I will collect the questions and send them to the speakers for a later reply. For those of you who are on YouTube, please send me your questions to the same address, and we will paste them into the chat and read them aloud. The event is being streamed on YouTube, so if you ask a question from Zoom, you're giving your consent to be streamed and recorded. Please feel free to distribute the link to everybody who might be interested so that they can receive the flyer. And now I leave the floor to Alessandra Giorgi, who will moderate tonight's epic battles in linguistic history.
Hello, welcome everybody, welcome Sandhya, welcome Eric. Tonight's flash mob will be about the binding theory. The binding theory is an important subfield of formal linguistics in that it connects syntax and syntactic representation with referential properties. As is well known, it was formalized in the late 70s, beginning 80s, and as a very neat and very elegant hypothesis concerning anaphors, pronouns, and the little more mysterious R expressions, ruled by principle A, B, and C respectively. And furthermore, we had a very elegant, very neat pro theorem following from this picture. Unfortunately, it soon turned out that that this very elegant theory worked almost perfectly for the English language. And scholars realized that as soon as other languages were taken into account, among which, for instance, Italian as well, things were rather different. The classical binding theory could not explain several phenomena which were present in these other languages, but not in English. These phenomena concerned items which, on the one hand, resembled anaphors, but on the other were not ruled by principle A or the bind in any obvious way. Hence, at that point, several different proposals came out to account for these other items as well. And many other languages have been investigated and studied with respect to their binding properties. And tonight, we open the discussion about the binding theory with our two distinguished scholars. And the first questions will be, what is your definition of anaphor? And Eric, would you like to answer this question first?
Yes, and thank you all for organizing this very interesting event. As to the definition of anaphor, yeah, I'm afraid I don't have one. At least not a definition in terms of the good old intrinsic properties like minus pronominal plus anaphoric. So the question is then, yeah, in what sense are elements like English itself, Icelandic Sig, or Mandarin G anaphors? Well, what I'm going to argue is that what can be defined as being used as an anaphor. Well, just very briefly as a historical background. Well, in Chomsky 81, yeah, indeed, this very nice condition, A, an anaphor must be bound in its governing category. But, well, we know a lot about long distance anaphors and given long distance binding by now. So this governing category could not in any reasonable way be extended to cover all the cases that have been come to light since. And well, actually, right, so there were we also discovered cases like with no linguistically expressed antecedent at all. Like there's this beautiful case discussed by Politis Sag in 1992. So John was going to get even with Mary. The picture of himself in the paper would really annoy her, as would the other stunts he had planned. Well, as you can see here, himself, yeah, has John as its antecedent, but it's not in the same clause. So there's no linguistic antecedent in the relevant sense. Also, Thraansen in 1991 gave this beautiful example for Icelandic, which I will not try to read because my Icelandic is too poor. But the English translation reads like, Mary was always so nasty. When Olaf would come, she would certainly tell Sig, and that's the person whose thoughts are being presented, not Olaf, to leave. Well, here there is really no linguistically expressed antecedent at all. So this is kind of problematic for the standard conception of anaphors as we had it in the 80s. Well, so, in work with Tanya, we came up with the following definition of anaphors, which is also more or less in line with the thoughts, the idea in the 1930s. So anaphors are referentially defective NPs, which entails, for example, that they cannot be used as demonstrative, referring to some entity in the world. Yep. Well, actually, at Keenan, personal communication pointed out to me that actually there are certain varieties of English that allow users himself in a very different way, right? As in all of a sudden, himself came in, or himself is used to refer to some individual with a certain dignified status. But yeah, okay, well, is this an anaphor? No. But what is the difference between this use of himself and himself in other cases, say in the case of one? Well, what helps? Actually, there is one very important instrument we got since Alexandra's work, namely the split antecedent test. Pronouns can have split antecedents and anaphors cannot. So for instance, in the following case, John asked Mary to hide themselves. Yeah, well, themselves cannot pick up the conjunction of John and Mary. So in a sense, this sentence is simply ill-formed. And if you take a variant of the sentence, namely you embed themselves in a picture MP, John asked Mary to hide those pictures of themselves, and all of a sudden it becomes fine. So in an exempt position, themselves can take split antecedents. In a non-exempt position, it cannot take split antecedents. So that is at least a way of distinguishing those two cases. But of course, the question is why? So why do anaphors of pronouns, why is it that pronouns can take a split antecedents and anaphors cannot? At least anaphors of a particular type. Well, in my 2011 book, I suggest the following. What I say is that the term anaphor, as it was used in the canonical binding theory, really lacks theoretical significance. But what can be defined is being used as an anaphor. And a particular element is used as an anaphor if and only if it is linked to its antecedent by a syntactic operation, such as move or agree. So in the case like John asked Mary to hide themselves, the self part of themselves covertly moves until the predicate, reflexifies it, and of course, then we get a mismatch because the themselves is plural and the pro controller Mary is singular. So you get an ill-formed result. But if themselves is embedded, as in the picture case, so John asked Mary to hide those pictures of themselves, well, it cannot be moved. And consequently cannot be construed as a reflexivizer. Hence, it is interpreted as a type of phenomenal and allows a split antecedent, as we would expect. So, yeah, this takes care of Kim's example, and also explains why true anaphors, unlike exempt anaphors, phenomenals, don't allow split antecedents. Again, thanks to Alessandra's test. If you look at standard cases in Icelandic, again, an agreed chain is possible. So if you look at, I don't have any Icelandic I can reasonably pronounce. So take an example like John said, Mary, to have made me wash, see. Well, there, see can take either John or Mary. And in those cases, a chain, an agreed chain is possible according to the more complicated lines I explained in my book, and also in the contribution to the SYNCOM. So those cases, a chain is possible, and you can have an anaphor. So again, wherever an element like self can hop onto a predicate, reflexifies it, you don't get split antecedents, you have an anaphor in this sense. And again, whenever an agreed chain is established between seek and its antecedent, you also have an anaphor in the sense that in this case, seek is used as an anaphor.
Okay.
How am I doing in terms of time?
Yes, almost. That's very good anyway.
Almost.
Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Yeah.
And Sandhya, would you like to reply?
One final remark, if I want to say, well, it seems reasonable to restrict this term being used as an anaphor to elements in argument position, because there are always all kind of tests that show that you should exclude expressions like Indonesian diri. That's worked by Bambang Kartono, one of my students, and also reflexivizing affixes such as Russian sha or meadow, mari, alt, ult, worked by Anna Volkova. But of course, what I say is it has no theoretical significance, but of course one can keep using the term anaphor for very clear cases. Yeah, that's what I had to say.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Sandhya?
Yes, I'm going to share my screen. Maybe you can let me know if that works. Can everybody see that?
It does, it works.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Wait, so sorry, for some reason I can't, okay, yeah. So I'm just gonna make it full screen. Okay, yeah, so I'm gonna say something similar to Eric. And the main point that I really want to make here is that so intuitively, an anaphor is some sort of nouny element that referentially co-varies, by which I mean it's systematically co-referent, not accidentally co-referent with some other nouny element, right? Very intuitively, this is a good way to think about anaphors. But what I'd like to stress here is that I don't think there's a single definition of anaphor that can actually do justice to all the different types of anaphors that we see across languages. And what I mean very specifically is that there are distinct classes of anaphors in syntax and semantics, all of which have in common that they yield the same interpretive output, that the anaphor referentially co-varies with some other element. And this is not an analysis by any means. This is just a classification that I think makes sense. So I think it makes sense to think about anaphors as being bifurcated into syntactic versus semantic anaphors. And these are then further subdivided into subclasses, which I'll talk about. But the point that I'd like to make here is that all anaphors are semantic, but for a proper subset of these anaphors, the anaphoric dependency is already established in syntax. And that follows from the idea that the narrow syntax is a module that feeds into LF and PF. And if you assume that, then if an anaphor is, then if an element is anaphoric in syntax, it must necessarily also be anaphoric in semantics. But you can also have anaphors that are only semantic and not syntactic, I think. So what do I mean when I say syntactic anaphor? Very trivially, I think an anaphor is syntactically anaphoric if and only if it enters into a syntactic dependency with another nominal. This then feeds into LF and it's interpreted in different ways semantically, and it yields the output of referential covariance. And in a recent paper arguing within the minimalist framework, since we think of all syntactic dependencies in minimalism as involving the abstract operation of agree between a probe, an element that's looking for something, and a goal, an element that can grant it that thing, I defined an anaphor like this. A syntactic anaphor is a nominal. It's featurely deficient for some set of features gamma. It may just be a single feature. This must then be checked under agree with a nominal that is valued for gamma, and this can proceed via intervening functional heads. So Kratzer argues that binding can happen via, that the real antecedent is little b or t. So this can happen via intervening functional heads, but ultimately the element that's going to have that gamma feature is going to be another nouny element. So like I said, I think there are distinct classes of syntactic anaphors. So in my own work, I've looked a lot at what I call perspectival anaphors. So a subclass of these are long distance anaphors or logophors. Alessandra has done a lot of work on this for Italian. And a big part of what my work shows is that these kinds of anaphors are syntactic anaphors in the sense that they must lack some feature that is then encoded, that is then interpreted as perspective in the semantics. But you also have a different class of anaphors. This is the sort of better studied class of anaphors. Eric's done a lot of work on this. These are I'll call them loosely phi-based anaphors. These are anaphors that lack some or all phi features that may then again be subclassified into other subtypes. Others have argued that actually what an anaphor lacks is not a phi feature, it's directly a referential feature. I'll just call these phi-based feature deficient anaphors. Now, the important thing is that these categories are strictly independent. So in theory, you could have a perspectival anaphor that also lacks some or more phi features or vice versa. And I think there's empirical evidence for that. In terms of semantic anaphors, and here I'm going to defer to work by other people because I haven't worked on this as much, in particular work by Yorgos Spatas, who argues that semantic anaphors are also not a uniform class. So Eric mentioned arity reduction. So you can have an anaphor that's just an arity reducer. It essentially takes, it's a relation that it takes a relation and it turns it into a reflexive property. Or it could be a bound variable, right? So it's just a variable and then it's predicate abstracted and then it gets obligatorily bound. And alternatively, it could be a presuppositional identity enforcer. So what this means is it's an anaphor that takes two arguments and it says the relationship between two arguments can hold just in case the two arguments are identical. And Eric's 2011 book does a very nice case of talking about near identity between X and f of X in local cases. I would say this is a subclass of that kind of anaphor as well. Now, I said that you can have some semantic only anaphors, so anaphors that are only anaphoric in the semantic sense. And as what this means, what this entails is that they can but need not obey conditions of syntactic well-formedness, right, by definition. And I think thinking about anaphors in terms of referential covariance allows us to then subsume donkey pronouns and bound variable pronouns, for example. So donkey pronouns, the dependency, so in a sentence like every woman who buys a beer drinks it, that it is a donkey pronoun, it violates C command and locality. And that's okay because it's not syntactically anaphoric. Right, so it's one of those cases of either arity reduction, bound variable, identity presupposition, but it doesn't correspond to a nominal that has a deficient feature in syntax. And so syntactic rules don't have to apply to it. And the other thing is bound variable pronouns. So every man in the room told Susan that Mary hated him. This is a bound variable, can violate locality minimality. Again, that's okay. Now, what we also predict, if you assume a modular grammar where you have a syntax that feeds into LF and PF, is that a semantic only anaphor will not result in dedicated anaphoric morphology, right? And this seems to be correct. As far as I know, and if I'm wrong about this, I would love to hear about it. But as far as I know, there are no donkey pronouns or bound variable pronouns anywhere in language that have dedicated morphology. Right, these typically look like other anaphoric forms, or they look like superficially identical to pronouns. And I think that follows from the idea that they're semantic only anaphors. So that's where I'll stop.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. So, okay. So now we can move to the second question. And Sandhya, again, will you like to answer the second question, which is, what are the locality conditions on different types of anaphors?
Yeah. So
5 minutes again.
Okay. So I think having this typology of syntactic versus semantic gives us an easy way to sort of think about how locality should work, right? So in brief, syntactic anaphors must obey conditions of locality. And the advantage of thinking about this as a general sort of abstract agree operation is that you don't have to have a binding module. You don't have to say, but anaphors have to be local. The idea that anaphoric binding, syntactic anaphoric binding is local simply follows from the idea that all agree dependencies are local. And this is a point that others have made. But semantic anaphors can obey locality. It shouldn't say syntactic, it can obey locality, but they don't have to. So, you know, the sort of classic anaphors that have been studied, English herself, German sich, Icelandic zig, and so on, the syntactic good behavior of these kinds of classic reflexives, these reflexives wear their syntactic good behavior on their sleeve. So you can see on the surface that these are good anaphors. They obey syntactic conditions, binding condition A. So locality, C command, minimality, right? What I've worked on are, again, like I said, perspectival anaphors. And a subclass of this is long distance anaphors, logophors, so-called snake sentences, and so on. Now, these are anaphors that are defined by the property that their distribution is regulated by them being sensitive to mental or spatial perspective. So the antecedent has to denote a perspective holder. Right, and they've been attested in a number of languages. And like I said, Alessandra has done a lot of work on this on Italian, but it's a typologically wide variety of languages. And what these anaphors are notorious for is that, at least on the surface, they seem to violate standard conditions of syntactic well-formedness, right? So I work on Tamil, it's a Dravidian language. It has a perspectival anaphor called Tan, and I'll show you what I mean when I say that it's poorly behaved in the syntax. So in a sentence like 10, just look at the translation. Sri thought, Ram said, Sita saw, Tan. The antecedent is Sri. Sri is the matrix subject, can antecede Tan across both the medial subject and the innermost subject. And so it's non-local and non-minimal. And even worse than that, the antecedent is not even it's not deterministic. So Sri could be an antecedent, but Ram could also be an antecedent. right? And that's not something that you think is a sign of syntactic behavior. In constructions with side predicates, so-called backward binding, and I think Eric mentioned a different example, antecedent doesn't even need to C-command the anaphor, right? So self being poor affected Raman's brother. Raman is inside a complex DP and can antecede self outside of that. And my work has shown that this is just apparent. It's just on the surface. You dig a little deeper and you can see that these anaphors actually do obey syntactic well-formatedness principles. Now, we can make an interesting split here. With respect to antecedents, so stuff that happens outside the clause containing the anaphor, in Tamar, tan doesn't obey syntactic locality. We just saw this. It can be non-minimal, non-local, non-deterministic. But once you look within the clause that contains tan, it does show syntactic reflexes. So in my work, I've shown that the perspective, mental or spatial, that tan is sensitive to can actually trigger phi agreement on the verb, the clause-mate verb of tan. And you can also show that this perspective can feed not only into LF, but also into PF, which shows that there must be a component of it that happens in narrow syntax that can affect both modules. How do we make sense of this sort of schizophrenic behavior? I think we need to disentangle the notions of antecedent and binder, okay? So this is the model. So the antecedent is Raman or Sri or whoever, and the binder is a pronominal operator that is in the same clause as the anaphor, okay? Now this pronoun is introduced in a dedicated structural position. It agrees with the anaphor for some feature, which is interpreted as perspective. And crucially, it's a pronoun and it discourse pragmatically co-refers with the antecedent. This is just pronominal co-reference. So inside the clause, you get a syntactic dependency. Outside the clause, you get a pronominal co-referent dependency. And that's where the schizophrenia comes from. So antecedents, perspectival antecedents can violate rules of syntactic locality, minimality, and C-command like we saw. And Eric mentioned this. These kinds of anaphors also can take split antecedents and yield strict readings under ellipsis because it's a pronoun, right? It's the pronominal co-reference that does this. But once you look within the clause, you get these interesting restrictions. So within the clause that contain, or within a predication really, it can be a PP as well, there's exactly one perspectival pronoun per binding domain. So all occurrences of an anaphor in a single domain must be bound by the same antecedent, right? And you also get interesting anti-locality effects that follow from this. So in a sentence like Raman saw himself or Raman saw tan, that's not allowed. And this is a property that's been noted for perspectival anaphors, is that they're anti-local for the most part. And that can follow as a condition C violation. Whenever the pronominal binder C commands the antecedent, you get a condition C violation. And I argue that that's why that's disallowed. So the bottom line, and I'm going to sum up here, classic reflexive perspectival anaphors are syntactically anaphoric. They don't have a choice. They have to obey syntactic locality because all syntactic dependencies are local. Semantic anaphors can be required to be local, but need not be. When I say can be required to be local, I think arity reducers, they are, given that thematic predication is a local dependency, that might need to be local as well because it imposes restrictions on co-arguments of a single predicate. So that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. So now we have second questions and the other speaker, Eric. So what are the locality conditions on different types of anaphors for Eric?
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Well, again, a very interesting question. Actually, there is a presupposition in this question, namely that there is a typology of anaphors and that one somehow can look at an anaphor of some type and then say what the locality conditions that apply to it are. Well, used to say, that's quite some time ago, complex anaphors are local and simplex anaphors allow non-local binding. That's, let's say, in early work by Pierre Picard and many others. But of course, we have learned since that time, the reality is a bit more complex than that. So for instance, work on Malayic languages, for instance, by Peter Cole and also by my PhD student with Martin Bambang Kartono has shown that, for instance, Indonesia has anaphoric expressions like deringa, Javanese has avacade. They're complex. They consist of a body part, diri, and a predominant element, ya, in the case of Indonesian, but they allow both local and non-local binding. And local binding is only obligatory if some kind of additional element, sendiri, or in the case of Japanese, deva, is added. So just for ease of reference, let's use the term semi-reflexive for complex elements that allow both local and non-local binding. Well, Anna Volkova found a similar pattern in Meromari. Meromari has a complex form, skenge, consisting of a form ske, self, and a possessive marker, and a doubly marked form, skenge, consisting of skenge, a the oblique case, and followed by a bare form, ske. And Pasha Rudnev, investigated Avar with a Dagestani language and found such a pattern as well. So can we say that super complex expressions like dirinya, sendiri are local, and that simplex anaphoric expressions are both local and non-local, and that semi-reflexive like dirinya are complex, but also allow both local and non-local binding as well? Is that simple? But if you were to say this overlooks the differences between simplex anaphors like Dutch zich and Norwegian zij on the one hand, and those semi-reflexives on the other. So for instance, zich and its cognates in Scandinavian languages are sensitive to verb class. So you typically do not find them with love type verbs or admire type verbs. And so basically you do not find them with subject experienced verbs. And they are always very happy with agent theme verbs like wash or like defend. The zich and its cognates, they don't allow statue readings, or they don't allow object comparison under ellipsis. So Charles washed better than Sue cannot mean Charles washed better than he washed Sue. And if you, instead of the English wash, you use the Dutch case, you see the same, right, with zich. But if you use zichzelf, the complex one, it is fine. So dirinya and similar verbs, elements, they are insensitive to the verb class, and they do allow object comparison. In a nutshell, the comparison between simple reflexives and semi-reflexives shows that there is much more to locality than just the superficial type. And in addition, well, this is just the internal composition of those elements, but also the syntactic environment plays a role. So for instance, compare Dutch zich and Norwegian zij. Zich allows an antecedent outside, so it's not strictly local, outside the causative or perceptive verb complement containing it, but you cannot have zich in the Dutch equivalent of an English to infinitive. But for Norwegian, zij, such infinitives are not barriers for binding at all. There's those great examples by Lars Halland, which he shows how zij can be bound across a number of infinitive barriers. And well, such cases are impossible in Dutch. So the question is, it's unlikely that this is due to differences in inherent properties of zich versus zij. But as I discussed in my 2011 book, it is due to a structural difference in the position of infinitive complements relative to the verb. In Dutch, a feature chain and degree chain supporting binding would be disrupted due to the exposition structure. And I'm using exposition structure very descriptively. So we don't know, we know that there's various, let's say, accounts of exposition, but the main point is this. In Dutch, subordinate clause is standard SOV. If you have an infinitive clause, it has to be to the right of the verb. Well, in Norwegian, canonical objects and complement clauses are in the same relative position to the verb. And well, there is a kind of complex derivation I have in my book where it shows that, well, in this case, the chain gets disrupted, and in Norwegian it doesn't. Consequently, you can have binding into two infinitive clauses, or at least the counterpart of that in Norwegian, but not in Dutch. Well, another case that is interesting to mention is Russian. So in Russian, so we get a different type of locality effect. The anaphor is себя, himself, or свой, yes. can be non-locally bound by an animate antecedent, but not by an inanimate antecedent. So you different locality conditions depending on whether the antecedent is animate or inanimate. Zubkov, in his dissertation, shows that the operation involved is binding by degree, in fact, multiple degree. As he shows, there are two routes to form a dependency. One route is via the person feature, which is located high in the C domain, only for animates, or via the number feature, that is for inanimates and animates alike. In the case of non-local binding, if you try to do a non-local binding trick, the number feature incurs a locality violation, whereas the person feature, due to the distribution of these features across the sentence, the various layers, does not. So there's one operation degree, which is sensitive to intervention effects by number. Consequently, you get non-local binding when the subject, the antecedent, is animate, but you do not get the possibility for non-local binding if the antecedent is inanimate. Also, Mandarin is interesting. So the anaphor G allows both local and non-local binding. And of course, there's a well-known difference that in the case of non-local binding, it is subject to the so-called blocking effect, sensitive to first and second person pronouns on the past between an envisaged third person antecedent and the anaphor G. And there's also an animacy requirement on the antecedent. But in the case of local binding, it's not. And that's a contrast that was noted as early, maybe even earlier, by Huang and Liu, 2001. And also discussed extensively in Ian Gibling's 2016 MIT dissertation. And okay, how do you get this contrast? In a recent Elias Quip with Sally Wang and Martin Everaert, and see also Sally Wang's forthcoming dissertation, we showed that against the standard, almost consensus in the literature, the anaphor G is complex. It's not simplex. It consists of a reflexivizing operator D and a defective pronoun type element G. And local binding obtained when D applies to the predicate, reflexivizing it. And this operation applies blindly. So basically you have the D, it sees the predicate, hops into it, reflexivizes it. No role of any kind of properties of the arguments binding, occupying the open positions of the predicates. So it's entirely indifferent to the nature of the arguments of the predicate. And in the case of non-local binding, multiple degree, target the G component, blocking effect follows. And this is extensively discussed by Ian Gipling in his dissertation, and it's based on Andrew Nevin's contiguity requirement. The upshot: there is no unified class of locality requirements. If you really want to understand locality, you really have to go into the nitty-gritty details of the feature composition of the elements and the properties of the environment. And if you don't do that, you get a much too superficial picture of what's really happening. And this is in fact what I argued to be the feature determinative thesis in my 2011 book. If I have time.
We are running out of time.
Sorry?
We are running out of time, a little bit out of time.
I couldn't understand. I have run out of time?
Yeah, well, yes, but please go ahead, but okay. Remember that we are already quite far from.
Okay, yes. So there is a further interesting issue in Mandarin, again, illustrating how, say, there's no absolute locality requirement on this element CG. So in Mandarin, you have this reflexivizing prefix G. So if you apply the prefix G to a verb, it becomes reflexive. Well, this is like you see in many other languages. However, this can also happen to a verb that takes a clausal complement. So you can have the Z prefix to a verb taking a clausal complement. And actually in this clausal complement, this can have more deeply embedded clausal complements. Now, the interesting thing is, if there is an occurrence of CG, or even a pronominal ta in this complement, it cannot be bound. Also, in general, Mandarin allows non-local binding very freely, but in this case, you have to pick the subject of the Z verb, even if this thing is embedded in a large complex. So you cannot go beyond the subject of the Z verb. Interestingly, it may happen that you have to stay lower, namely the same blocking effect, which is also operative in, let's say, the higher domain, is also operative in the domain of the Z verb. So if you have CG and there is there's such a first or second person pronoun intervening between the CG and the subject of the Z verb, then it has to stay lower. Well, this pattern can be explained by making explicit, and this is what we do in our script, how Z works as an operator. And again, it makes little sense to ask about the locality conditions of CG in isolation of the syntactic environment in which it occurs. So again, this instantiates what I refer to as the feature determinacy thesis. And note, the property of the Z is simply, it is there as a morphological element affecting the property of the verb. So it's not something we invented, it's simply morphologically there. And well, I realize exploring this feature determinacy thesis is really a challenge. And as a next step is being taken up by Duan Ngoc for Vietnamese, which is also highly interesting for this perspective. But that's something which will come in at some later stage.
Okay, thank you very much. So we can move to the third question, and please recall, both of you, that you actually have 5 minutes for answering the question. But thank you very much. So the third question is now for Sandhya, is the following: are grammatical and morphological features relevant in the distribution of anaphors?
Yeah, so let me share a slide again. Yeah, so again, I'm going to go back to my typology of syntactic versus semantic only anaphors that I talked about in the beginning. And definitionally, I think morphosyntactic features are relevant for syntactic anaphors. It's almost a trivial statement, and it's not relevant for semantic only anaphors. So donkey pronouns, bound variable pronouns, and so on. What I'd like to, so going forward, I'm only going to talk about syntactic anaphors because that's the only subclass of anaphors that this is really relevant for. The point I'd like to make is that syntactic anaphors are actually featurally non-uniform. So they can vary across languages and individual structures with respect to what features they lack in syntax. In a recent paper, I came up with, I suggested this as a typology, a feature classification. So there are 2 main classes, which I already talked about in the beginning, which is phi-based anaphors, so could lack a phi feature, some sort of phi feature. And then you have perspectival anaphors, and these are independent feature classes, right? So they can co-occur on a single anaphor. But even within the phi-based set of anaphors, it seems to be very hard to come up with a single feature or set of features that every single one of these anaphors lacks. And especially the evidence for this comes from person case constraint, so person asymmetries. Person case constraint, PCC effects that apply to anaphors, they apply to some anaphors, they don't apply to others, right? And then you have special, what's called anaphoric agreement, so dedicated morphology that is triggered only under anaphors. You see these in many Bantu languages. Again, you see this in some cases and not others. And you also have very interesting person restrictions on antecedents, right? So this is an observation going back to Bernard Comrie from back in the day, that there are specific person restrictions. And so what I argue is that we should at least think about 3 distinct types of person classes for anaphors. But of course, this is not the only way we can do it. So a PhD student of Hedda Zijlstra's and mine, Louise Reynaud, just wrote a dissertation coming up with a different alternative, which is arguably better, right? So so what are the reflexes of an anaphor lacking morphosyntactic features? How can you tell, right? So one is syntactic locality. We already talked about this. And then I'll go through the others one by one. So feature matching, right? So if a syntactic anaphor is deficient for some feature gamma, and it agrees with its antecedent for gamma, then it must necessarily match the antecedent for gamma. I mean, this just follows from the idea that agree is a very simple operation. It's just feature valuing or feature checking. So if you're just going to value the features of your antecedent or check the features of your antecedent, then you have to end up feature matching, right? But the interesting point I'd like to make here is that you can get feature mismatches for any other features that have not been agreed for, as long as you maintain the output of referential covariance, right? So if the anaphor is deficient for gamma, then it can feature mismatch for alpha, as long as you still get referential covariance at the end of the road. So I argue that this happens in 2 cases, maybe more, but these are 2 cases. One is in cases of indexical shift, right? So in these cases, an anaphor may be first person, but its antecedent may be third person. And that's okay, because indexical shift is a phenomenon where you shift the speech context. And so the first person feature is evaluated against a different speech context than the third person feature of the antecedent. And so even though there is fine mismatching between the 2, you still get referential identity, right? So that happens in Tamar, I argue. Another case is in Hausa. So this is an example by Martin Haspelmatt. He notes that you can get number mismatches with Hausa anaphors. And what I argue, and independent evidence shows that Hausa anaphors actually lack person and not number, right? It's an interesting question why these number mismatches happen, but it's not as weird as if there were person mismatches. Now, another reflex of feature deficiency is that it can feed both LF and PF. So it can have both a morphological effect and an interpretive effect. And there's a very interesting case that I found in doing fieldwork on dialects of Tamar. This is the Palakkad dialect of Tamar. And speakers of this dialect will tell you that they actually have 2 reflexive forms. So if I had a sentence like Raman didn't like himself, they can either say Raman didn't like Tan, which is the dedicated anaphoric form, or they can say, this is similar to what happens, they can say Raman didn't like, and then use a reflexive form that is identical to the pronominal form. Now, you have languages like Frisian and Middle English, where you can say Raman didn't like, or John didn't like him to mean John didn't like himself. But this is weirder, right? You have a case where these speakers do have access to a dedicated anaphoric form, but they can also use a pronominal form in the exact same position. And these differences are not arbitrary. They correlate with systematic interpretive differences. So if you ask speakers, when can you use Tan, when can you use the pronominal form, they will say, well, they're both anaphoric, so they both have some sort of self component, but Tan alone also has a perspectival component. So what that means is this additional perspectival meaning results in Tan having a different morphology, okay? Which then, given that syntax feeds into PF, we take to mean that perspective is represented as a feature that can feed both spell out and interpretation. There's also a recent MIT dissertation by Carrie Spadine, and she argues that in languages like Tigrinya, the perspectival pronoun, so I talked about how you can have a binder that's distinct from an antecedent, and the binder is a perspectival pronoun that's in the same class as the anaphor, and she shows that in a language like Tigrinya, there is an ill marking, an ill suffix that is actually the spell out of this perspectival head. And again, I think this is very strong evidence. If something can affect morphology and also affect interpretation, then under how we assume grammar works, we assume that it's actually syntactically encoded. A third way of knowing that something is syntactic is if it shows reflexes in other syntactic operations in the local domain. So this is one way to analyze the anaphor agreement effect. This is an observation going back to Luigi Rizzi, 1990, who observed that overwhelmingly across languages, anaphors cannot trigger co-occurring phi agreement. And one way to think about this, and this is, again, a PhD student of mine and Hedis, who argues that we can make sense of this if we assume that the anaphor and the phi probe are both deficient for phi features, and this is just sort of like a like repels like sort of timing-based interaction between the two. Another case, this is recent work, in a Tibeto-Burman language, Murphy and Meazza argue that you get a weird, I don't know if it's weird, you get a reflex of binding on a functional head, right? The actual reflex of binding on a little v head is actually overtly pronounced. And alternatively, Louise Reynaud argues that so-called anaphoric agreement is actually just a reflection of special features that only the anaphor bears and other nominals don't bear. So these are the, I think, ways to tell that something is syntactic or featurely encoded as opposed to being semantic only. But again, I'd like to stress, this doesn't mean all anaphors are like that, right? So you can definitely have anaphors that don't lack any syntactic features whatsoever. So the very fact of phi mismatch should not be taken to mean that all anaphors are a certain way, right? So that's, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. So now the same question for Eric.
Yes, thanks a lot, and thank you, Sandhya, for a very interesting presentation on a subject. My approach is a little bit more, let's say, more general. So the question is: are grammatical and morphological features relevant for the distribution of anaphors? And yeah, well, I would say yes, but depending on how we understand them. Let's say, well, there's a paper in 2011 by Alex Drummond, Dave Kush, and Norbert Hornstein. They formulated the consequences of distributed morphology. And they say, well, as a consequence, we have to assume that the form of the anaphor plays no real role in the interpretation afforded. And that's something to think about, right? Of course, taken literally, this is, of course, a truism, given the arbitrariness of the form meaning association, which we know since Saussure. So the fact that, well, if you look at the form stol, that's Russian for table. It's also a Dutch word for a particular type of loaf. Well, yes. So there's nothing in the form of stol that tells you whether it is a table or a loaf, except when you know it's Russian or Dutch. So it is a truism, but there has to be more to say about this issue, because there has to be some degree of transparency. And so, for instance, it cannot be accidental, I would say, that anaphors such as zich or sei, but also Russian sibya or Mandarin siji, are deficient for phi feature in a way that their pronominal counterparts are not. Or it cannot be accidental that elements like Dutch zichzelf or Icelandic zelf and zich, consisting of a phi feature deficient head and an additional element self, behave differently from their complex sources, and again differently from their English counterpart himself, with a head that is not phi deficient. So, for instance, in all those nice cases where you get exempt interpretation for English himself, well, in the case of Dutch, zichzelf, those cases are totally impossible. In fact, in order to get the exempt interpretation, you have to have himself. So you cannot use that with a phi deficient head of the self anaphor. It has to be a pronominal head of the self anaphor. And of course, it also cannot be accidental that super complex anaphors in Indonesian, like the Rinya Sendiri and Javanese Awaka de Dewe, and their counterparts, that they are local. And that, well, if you take out the Sendiri part, you'll get an anaphor that can be local and non-local. And so the morphosyntactic makeup of predominant element does tell us something significant about this behavior, despite the fact that, say, if you look at the surface, Derinja Sendiri and Awaka Dedeva have very different PF realizations. Now, so the issue of transparency is, I would say, a real issue in a field like distributive morphology. And I don't think we have solved it yet in a principled way. I will leave this because actually there's another interesting issue in current syntax. Namely, I would say there are some non-trivial issues with our standard use of syntactic features. And I must say, I just recently started to think about those. And let me focus on one. So we are used to dealing with features being valued or unvalued. And we have very nicely working analyses, let's say Giblin's analysis of Mandarin, of Peter Zubkov's, and my analysis of Russian, my, in the sense that is his dissertation, but we also worked on the paper together. In Giblin's analysis of Mandarin, the presence of a probe with an unvalued plus participant feature plays a crucial role. In the analysis of Russian, we have an unvalued person probe in the C domain and unvalued number probes in the same position and also right above the little VP. And within the nominal projection, they also play important roles. So at least we'll say that plus or minus valued functions as a useful diacritic in regulating the computation of syntactic dependencies. But it also leaves a fundamental question, namely acknowledged actually in the literature, I forgot where, but from early on, and to my knowledge not really resolved. What does plus or minus valued really mean? Could one conceive of syntax seeing whether a head is valued or unvalued apart from such a diacritic? Apart from this, if an element is unvalued, what is the it that is unvalued? Given a system with post-syntactic spellout where form and meaning are fundamentally decoupled, the identity of an element just cannot be borne by some constant part of its form. So if you have a traditional lexical item, you say, well, okay, I have an lexical item, which is for a meaning mapping, and well, this thing is unvalued for particular features, and I can fill in a particular hole with a particular feature and still have the same form. So I can essentially think of sich from the traditional lexical perspective as a lexical element, syntactic and morphosyntactic realization. Yeah. And in thinking about these issues, I was inspired by a handout of a recent talk by Omer Preminger. I don't know at all whether he will agree with what I say, but well, let's do it anyway. Grammatical features like speaker, participant, and also number features, or the syntactic encoding of perspective in Sandhya's work, they are best conceived then as pieces of meaning, instructions for interpretation. Instructions for interpretation that are visible to the syntactic computational system as labels of minimal elements, which we can think of as heads. Now, being unvalued does not involve the absence of an instruction of interpretation, because that does make sense. An unvalued element represents a partial instruction for interpretation. So this is then what I think should underlie the syntactic notion of being unvalued. And merge then builds structures using elements representing full and partial instruction for interpretation, and where partial instruction for interpretation are to be completed using material merged elsewhere. So for instance, if we have an unvalued person probe in the C domain, it is defective instruction. It needs the instruction from a constituent located elsewhere, but of course not too far away, to complete the instruction for interpretation it represents. Namely, whether to link the utterance to the coordinate system via the speaker, the addressee, or some other participant. Well,
so
of course.
Please, the 5 minutes. So
I have 2 lines.
so,
In order to represent such instructions, we also need a vocabulary and formation rules, and a principled way to determine how syntax can see partiality. So in one sense, it shifts the burden, but in another sense, it pushes the frontiers of our research. So we need a vocabulary to think about those instructions, we have to have a systematic representation of partiality of instructions. And well, I don't think we have this at the moment, but I think that is something that, well, I would like to work on, maybe, and hopefully others.
Okay, thank you very much. So we are going, so we are quite late, but the paper is now, the talks are open for questions and discussions. Please, if you have questions, you can write it on the chat. Okay, so here there is a question by Omer Preminger for everybody. Please go ahead, Omer.
I guess it's more of a question for Eric, though I'd be very happy to hear any thoughts from Sandhya on this if she has them. So you mentioned in your earlier comments, Eric, that one has to pay attention to the morphosyntactic makeup of the features that are doing the negotiation between binder and bindee, and you mentioned the distribution of person features being different from the distribution of number features.
Yes.
I'm sort of puzzled by the fact that it seems that this literature that you're talking about doesn't really pay attention to what the people who actually talk about 5-feature agreement and syntax have been up to in the last couple of decades. In particular, a growing consensus that, contrary to what, let's say, Nevins would claim, both third person and singular are syntactically represented as the absence of otherwise present privative features. I mean, I've argued for this, but
yeah,
by
I know.
now I'm far from alone. So you have work by Keine and Kuhn and Kalin, and there's a lot of evidence accumulating for this, which means that a third person anaphor talking to a third person antecedent has acquired exactly no features from it. So how is the relationship going to be syntactically represented there?
Okay, to be blunt, this has to be wrong. Actually, if you think about the last part of my talk, my speculations, right? If you the notion of being unvalued, well, which is indeed in much of literature being handled kind of and being used quite uncritically. What it means to be unvalued for person basically means, well, you have an instruction for looking for a person, and then it has to be specified whether or not you're looking for a speaker, an SRC, or a third type of participant in the speech act. And the third participant can indeed also be an individual, an item being talked about. So simply say, well, third is the absence of anything else. I don't think that is going to work. Well, even semantically. And if you think about, say, I can easily think of, say, if you think about number, what does it mean to have a instruction for number, either singularity or a plurality? The way I would like to think about it is indeed features are syntactic elements close to heads. Maybe there are heads. And if you think about agreement, it is really means, let's say, if you think about the agree operation, it really would mean moving the instruction singular from the goal via the probe to the element that is to be bound. And I don't think that, so I would have to go into detail into the literature you mentioned, which I acknowledge. I have not been doing this so far. But I am convinced that in the end, sharing a singular feature is not sharing the absence of plurality.
Yeah.
Can I answer that?
Because I have something to say about this.
Yeah, so I would respectfully disagree with you, Eric. I think so. The feature classification that I mentioned was actually motivated in part by the kind of distinction that Omer talks about, which, so Nevin's 2007, I think in his LLT paper, he talks about how there's two different types of third person. So one is an absence of person, and the other, and what I end up arguing in this paper is very much along those lines, is that you can have actually two different types of quote unquote third person, one which is an absence of person entirely, and that does leave empirical reflexes. So it takes antecedents of all person, for example. So Siji might be an example, right? The other is actually a person that stands negatively opposed to first and second person. So this is like a negative.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to, right?
Sorry, can I finish though? I think it's not so much, I think you were referring to that, but the part that I would disagree with is where you say that the lack of person doesn't make any sense, because I think it does make sense, and I think they're both attested. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. There is another question by Rita Manzini, a question on phases. Please, Rita, go ahead.
Yep.
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Short questions, short answers, because we have more
My question is starts rather apologetically. I haven't been doing binding for 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
But I have recently come upon something that I was very interested in for different reasons. A proposal that I'm sure you know about, especially Sandhya must have considered that, by Charnavel and Sportish in a linguistic inquiry article of 2016, where they say explicitly, I have it by memory, what I remember certainly is that they propose that the locality condition on normal anaphors, which is essentially T to V, is, well, what we know independently as the spell out domain. At the externalization interface. And I seem to remember that they also argued that agree per se, that is minimality, which comes with agree, is not sufficient as a locality constraint. And so I wonder if you could address that proposal, which seemed to me, as I remember it, very convincing, and which I'm interested in for other reasons, because the C to V domain is so important for other things, verb movement, for instance, right? It's that.
Okay.
And so either order.
Okay. There is
short questions, because short answer, because we have several questions.
It is pretty clear that their proposal that, let's say, non-local binding is always, let's say, local binding plus some additional mechanism is incompatible with and also makes predictions for, let's say, binding in Mandarin. And those predictions are not borne out. They predict that in case of non-local binding, you have split antecedents, which in Mandarin you don't. Moreover, if you elaborate, if you look at the proposal, the way it has been developed by Ian Giblin for Mandarin, well, there is no need for some additional mechanism, just agree all the way down. If you look at, say, Russian, the proposal that Petr Zubkov made for Russian, again, it accounts for non-local binding and it accounts for the animus effect in Russian without any additional mechanism. Moreover, in Russian, what you see is that there are animus effects in more local configurations, namely when you have binding into DPs with a subject. It's very hard to see how that kind of phenomenon could be captured by Charnavel.
Yeah, but Eric, I wasn't talking about logophoric or perspectival binding. That's another thing yet. I was just thinking about the sort of hard syntactic core. Is it agree, therefore minimality, or is it phases? That was the question.
Okay. My question is that my point is that in terms of binding, But if you look, if I look at the situation in Mandarin, Gibbon's proposal is based on the idea that there are no phasal boundaries there. Moreover, in terms of agree, it is unclear. But there's a proposal of Boskowitz where, in fact, agree is not sensitive to phases. In general, I think there is some. Well, there are significant problems with the notion of a phase in terms of binding theory in general. Because if the assumption is that phases are closed, elements that are closed for subsequent operations, the fact that, let's say, variable binding, the semantic binding that Sandhya talked about is, oblivious to any kind of boundary. Raises questions for what is it that is in fact being transferred, unless, of course, you say, well, phases only affect the transfer to the realization system. That might be a possibility, but in that case, it becomes irrelevant for binding.
Can I say something here?
Okay. Yes, Sandhya, please.
Thanks. So the Charneval's-Portiche work, so there's a lot of similarities with what I say and what they say, and we sort of ended up sort of talking about it in tandem, which is nice. And I think I think this is a really, really interesting question with respect to whether it has to be phases or minimality. And in my work, I assumed that it was phasal. Because this seems to be vary across languages. So Tamil is very, let's say, promiscuous. It allows anaphora into PPs, into DPs, little BPs, and CPs. And I thought, okay, so every single phasal domain, you have exactly one perspectival pronoun. But now when I think about it, this actually does vary across languages. So in Italian, you get long distance anaphora across subjunctives and not across indicatives. And you don't, as far as I know, get it into PPs. I mean, Alessandra can correct me, or you can correct me. But languages vary with respect to what predications allow count as binding domains. And I think it might, more and more, I think it might be more elegant to think about it in terms of minimality rather than in terms of phases, where you think that there is some, so anti-locality, for example, right? That falls out of like a relativized a minimality condition if you assume that a perspectival binding involves a perspectival feature, which crucially not every DP has. And so if you have something like John loves self, and the self is in the object position and John is in subject position, John does not have the perspectival feature that you need. And that perspectival feature is higher up. And so you get locality, but for a different feature, right? So there is no minimality violation. So the answer is I don't know. I think that's a really interesting question. And yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. We can move to the next question, which is by Hagit to Eric. Please, Hagit, you can.
Yeah, it's a brief comment, and it's not to the center of what you had to say, and it has to do with the comment that I didn't understand about how DM predicts somehow that the nature of the anaphor would not interact with the interpretation. I don't think there is any such prediction.
No, that's the statement. I quoted.
I know you quoted. I didn't catch who you quoted, but they're wrong. Okay.
Yeah, they're wrong. Yes, that was the upshot.
Who did you quote?
I quoted a paper by Dave Kirsch and Norbert Hornstein, and what was
okay. I don't think they understand DM. That's all I have to say. At least they don't understand what the nature of late vocabulary insertion might be, because vocabulary insertion could be directly sensitive to the kind of binding relationship that is the input to it, and distinguish through the there's absolutely no prediction from DM one way or the other. I mean, there may be for a particular execution of the binding relationship, but certainly not a general one. I don't know. There are other people around here who do DM.
The only point is I took it up because there have been some attempts to say, well, binding theory and all the difference between different types of anaphors is just a matter of, let's say, low-level realization. So there was a paper by I think Jabal Zwart in the 19s where he said, well, okay, you have one core of binding theory, and then some language simply decide to spell it out, a particular element, to spell it out as a pronoun, another language spells it out as an anaphor, and the other language spells it out as a complex anaphor, and that's just a matter of...
Well, it couldn't be this and it couldn't be the opposite. I mean, it's not a low-level realization, and it's not an abstract representation that cannot distinguish between realizations. I don't think it's either one or the other.
Yeah. So
I just think it's an orthogonal issue. That's the only thing. It has nothing to do with
my point. The point I want to make, that this cannot be right because there are all kinds of differences in makeup of anaphoric expressions that really reflect.
I agree with you, but that doesn't mean DM makes no such prediction as the one that you.
Okay, well, yeah, that's a correction, but yeah.
Sandhya, would you like to add anything? No, not this. Okay, so we have another question from Chiara Giannollo. Please, Chiara.
I hope it's not too general given the time. I was wondering about the typological import of your results, because you gave us interesting typologies of what anaphors can be. I was wondering, do you have a typology of which kind of anaphors languages can have? So how the system can look like? Are there implicational relations? If you have a certain type of anaphor, then you will also have another type of anaphors, or maybe it's impossible for a language to have two objects of a given type. And I was thinking that maybe if you have some hypotheses on this, we could understand something more about also paradigmatic effects. So how some items, get meaning just because they have a contrast in a system, or because of the elsewhere principle. And so that was my.
The problem is that, of course, I could give you, say, a rough typology of anaphors. So we have a simplex anaphors of the type of Dutch zich or Icelandic zij, a core of 5 features, maybe some further functional material around it, but that's it. Then you have complex anaphors of the type, you have some body part and positive elements like in, let's say, Indonesian darinya, and you can have another element sendiri coupled to it, and there is a proposal by Omar Preminger, which is based on work by Jane Middleton, which would give you this type of this type of sequence of configurations. There are certain differences which they do not in their work pay attention to, but let's say it gives you this kind of hierarchical structure. The point is only you need to take into account very specific properties of those elements. So let's take, for instance, Mandarin ta seji, which is the pronoun, together with seji. Well, the majority, as far as I know, of Mandarin speakers will assume that ta seji is local. However, there is literature claiming that this consensus is incorrect, and presumably there is some variation here among speakers. There are people who argue that ta seji may, in fact, under certain conditions, be used non-locally. So then you have to figure out, what would happen? So what would be the difference between the standard, let's assume it is a standard variety of Mandarin in which ta seji is local, and the varieties in which it is non-local? Well, the moment you have an element like ta seji, basically you would have to look at the internal structure. How are the pieces of ta seji glued together, so to speak? And it is pretty much conceivable that there are ways of construing ta with seji. Seji works like an emphatic element. So what you get is a pronoun, and of course the pronoun can be non-local. But that would require a very detailed investigation of this particular dialect, this particular variant, in order to come up with a reasonable hypothesis as to why and exactly how it differs from the what I think on the basis of literature is a standard.
Okay, Sandhya. Would you like to answer?
Yeah, I would. So that's a really interesting question. I don't know that I have anything to say about featural implications, but you asked about paradigmatic restrictions. And I know about one typological restriction that, as far as I know, doesn't have a counterexample. Again, if there's one, I'd love to know about it. And this has to do with person restrictions on antecedents. So a lot of anaphors, like in German or Romance, right? Japanese and so on, they only take third person antecedents. You do have anaphors like Ciji in Chinese, which can take first, second, and third person antecedents. Now, what you also have anaphors like English himself and herself, where you have myself, yourself, himself, themself. You have 3 dedicated forms, right, for different persons. What is not attested is the opposite of what you get in, say, Italian, where you have a language which has a dedicated anaphoric form, but only for first and second and not third. And this was a typo. I was very excited. I thought I had found this out. Turns out Bernard Comrie wrote about this back in '99. So this is a typological gap. So what it says is, in a language that has only one unambiguously or dedicated anaphoric form, this has to correspond to a third person anaphor. So what that means is, you don't have a language anywhere that has dedicated forms for first and second, but not for third. And another way to think, and as far as I know, we know about what are so-called fake indexicals. These are bound variable uses of first and second person pronouns. Observation going back to Part T in the 80s. So I'm the only one who finished my homework, where the my is interpreted as a bound variable. There is no language, as far as I know, where a fake indexical looks different from a real indexical. So that is the paradigmatic gap that I can offer you. Beyond that, as far as restrictions, I think they may be less, they sort of follow from the idea. Again, if you think about syntactic versus semantic anaphors, you predict that locality restrictions have to obligatorily apply to syntactic anaphors. They can still independently apply to semantic anaphors if they end up dealing with thematic co-argumenthood and things like that. But there is no necessity that those kinds of anaphors have to obey locality, minimality, C command, and so on. So that's what I have to say. And as for why this antecedents restriction holds, I don't know. I would love to know. But that seems to be, as far as I know, without a counterexample. So.
Thank you both.
We have a question now by Guglielmo Cinque. Please, Memo, go ahead.
Oh, well, thank you for your very nice presentations. I have a short question for Eric, which is probably related to Agit's question. Namely, when you quoted the difference between the contrast between a case of local, binding and binding into a DP. John asked Mary to hide themselves, which is bad, as opposed to John asked Mary to hide that picture of themselves, which apparently. Yeah. So I was wondering whether one could rule out the possibility that the antecedent, in between antecedent of themselves, is actually a little pro, which would not be a split antecedent, but would be a real antecedent. So I don't know what the facts are, but suppose you put a different subject of pictures, like John asked Mary to hide Peter's pictures of themselves. Then that would discriminate between themselves as a real anaphor, if that's bad, or like a pronoun, if that's good. I don't know what the facts are, though.
I recall from, well, this goes beyond my interest about English, but I recall from experiments by Jeff Runner that also in the latter case, themselves could go out. So there is a contrast here between, let's say, a yeah, well, let's say in the then piece, an element in the possessive position of the DP, it always triggers a strong condition B effect. Yeah, but the condition, the anaphor can get out in the picture now cases. That's what I recall, but I did not read it recently.
Okay, thank you.
Can I say something? Yeah. So I just wanted to mention very quickly that the little pro option is essentially what I argue for perspectival anaphors, as I mentioned, and that's how you get split antecedents. And it's very similar to work by Isabel Charneval with some variation. So the idea is that actually when you get a so-called logophoric dependency or long distance dependency, which you actually have, in those languages where you get split antecedents, that's because the relationship is actually pronominal. It's actually pronominal co-reference. So, and it's a little pro. I mean, in some languages, it can be overt, like in Tigrinya, like I said, the head can be overt. But the idea is that there does seem to be other evidence that there is a silent pronoun in those cases.
Okay, with that caveat, that at least there are some languages where this, well, putative, I mean, they suggest it, right? They claim it is, but it's, this generalization, which they would like to be the case, right? That's the way she puts it. That long distance, non-local binding always is mediated by this pronominal element, does not hold for Mandarin.
That's fine. I'm not making any claim about Mandarin. I'm just saying that that in some languages this is what happens, and it's not just. I mean, there is evidence for it morphologically as well, right, and syntactically.
Okay, so we are decidedly running out of time. So I thank Sandhya and I thank Eric and the organizers. And so let's see each other to the next flash mob.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Eric.
Well, thank you, everybody. Also, on my part, we announced the next linguistic flash mob, which will be held on the 17th of December. The time is always the same. The title is Nature and Nurture. And we are inviting Charles Young from UPenn and Ken Wexler from MIT. I hope to see you all there. And as usual, many thanks to the group that is supporting us. Look, we also have a new blog, which is, you know, I hope it will enhance discussion on the web. And I invite everybody to go and have a look there and also post questions and answer for a lively discussion. And as usual, I thank everybody from our security, music director, graphic artist, and also, you know, everybody in the organizing committee that you can see here. See you on the 17th. Bye.
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 Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Ciao, ciao Eric.
Ciao. Ciao.